Hello and welcome to the fourth and final part of the lecture. We ended the last section by talking about the two stages of transition to political society. In the first stage, everybody agrees to give up part of their rights, including their individual rights to punish other lawbreakers, and commits to supporting political society. In the second stage, they determine the form of government, they entrust the offices of government to particular people. But crucially, the rights of the government are not largely absolute, as in Hobbes, but are limited by the natural rights of individuals and are conditional on being directed to remedy the inconveniences of the state of nature. It's those inconveniences that have led people to transition to civil society. So the trust of government, what government is entrusted to do, is to focus on remedying those inconveniences. In order to sustain that trust, Locke supports a division of powers within government, particularly the separating of legislative functions and executive functions, in order to avoid, as it were, tempting people to concentrate power, or giving people the temptation that arises from the concentration of legislative and executive powers. Similarly, the Parliament can be dissolved. You can call for new elections, new representation, but that power is to be used for the public good. And then finally, reverting back to the fact that we had an individual right to punish that we've now given up with the moves to civil society, government must punish wrongdoers, but it must do so consistently and proportionately. You remember that one of the inconveniences of the state of nature was that punishment was not applied consistently, nor necessarily proportionally. So it's an important part of government in civil society that consistent and proportionate punishment of wrongdoers be exercised to protect the natural rights, the life, liberty and property of others. What governments don't have on Locke's account is any arbitrary power over the lives and fortunes of other people. Now, although we classically think of Locke as a liberal, in this respect, he echoes the Republicans who were Hobbes's opponent. Locke appeals to the notion of arbitrary power. So one part of being free in civil society for Hobbes, and the freedom for which we enter civil society, is to be free from rulers exercising arbitrary power over us. Particularly, the ruler does not have the power to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish subjects, all of which would be exercises of arbitrary power. Nor can the ruler transfer the making of laws into other hands, say, their own hands, transfer them from the Parliament to, as it were, the Prime Minister or a sovereign. Finally, the ruler does not have the right to remove legitimately held property from subjects and citizens. Remember, we have natural rights to property, where that includes, as it were, the product of our labour. And so the government has no right to remove such property from us. There's an important contrast with Hobbes here. Remember that the sovereign for Hobbes does have the right and power to remove property from those in civil society. Hobbes, of course, argues that the ruler would be prudent not to do so, that it's likely to cause dissent and possibly rebellion against the ruler. In Hobbes, however, the ruler has no right to take such property. So he says the supreme power cannot take from any man a part of his property without his own consent. Okay? Because we've moved into civil society in part to secure our right to property, government has strict limits on removal. Now, it is important to note that this only applies to property that is legitimately ours, that is legitimately acquired. Locke provides no protection to people who have acquired property in ways that are illegitimate. For example, one might think through colonialism. Now, Locke's relationship to colonialism is a complicated one, but it's clear that acquisition of property by conquest does not constitute a legitimate basis on which to have a right to that property. It's one thing to say that rulers must be limited. An important question is how you keep them limited. And this is where Locke endorses separation of powers, as I've already mentioned. Locke's concerned that human beings as fallible beings are liable to corruption. They're liable to seeing their own interests as more important than others. They're liable to having their reason distorted by self-interest. So the separation of powers is crucial for Locke in keeping separate, as it were, lawmaking and law execution, and avoiding the potential for corruption that joining them might give. As Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there are good reasons to avoid absolute power. Rulers, Locke argues, are necessarily bound by the terms of the social contract. And they're put in place, they're selected in the second stage of the transition by the consent of the people. Because they're put in place by consent, consent can be withdrawn. Okay. Rulers can lose the consent of the people if they depart from the protection of natural rights and the commitment to remedying the inconveniences of the state of nature, which is the purpose of government. And this brings us to a further important contrast with Hobbes. For Hobbes, there is no right to rebellion of the people against the sovereign, the people against the government. For Locke, however, there is a justified right to rebellion. If the government transgresses the rules of society, either it extends its scope beyond that it legitimately has, or it seeks to undermine or overcome the division of powers. In other words, in any ways in which government seeks to surrender the trust or lose the trust in which it has been granted, then the people may think that it is right to rebel, and where they do, they're legitimately able to do so. They can, as it were, be justified in choosing to remove a government and establish a new one. That is, of course, what happened in England in what's called the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when one monarch was removed and replaced by another. Now, whereas Hobbes thought that the phenomenon of natural rebellion against the sovereign would simply throw people back into the state of nature, for Locke that's not the case. Remember, the state of nature is a two-stage step to civil society. Removing the government, removing the monarch, simply takes you back to stage one, in which you've agreed in the social compact to give up various powers, and reinstitutes the need for a new stage two, in which you redesign government and choose new people to take on government tasks. So, overthrowing a ruler, exercising the right to legitimate rebellion, doesn't throw you back into the state of nature. It simply takes you back to the social compact and asks you to once again take up the second stage of that compact. So let's end with a couple of comparisons with Hobbes. Locke's claim is that the inconveniences of the state of nature can be remedied without an unlimited and unconditional authority, without an absolute sovereign, and also without a unitary authority. Hobbes is against the separation of powers. Locke imagines it as necessary to protect us from corruption. Secondly, Locke wants to say that, look, if the inconveniences of the state of nature, if remedying those inconveniences required an absolute sovereign, it wouldn't be worth remedying them. We'd be better off staying in the state of nature with all its inconveniences. You remember we began this lecture at the very start with Locke's complaint that Hobbes simply wants people to give up the threat of polecats by surrendering to the threat of a lion. So Locke's trying to give us an account that shows that neither of those options are necessary. What about if remedying the inconveniences required an absolute sovereign? Well, then Locke says it would be impossible to remedy them. Because we're God's property, we have no right to sell ourselves into slavery, and submission to an absolute sovereign, as Hobbes recommends, would be precisely to make of ourselves slaves, creatures subject to the arbitrary power of a master. Now that all sounds great. It sounds like Locke's given us an account of how we can have limited government, justified rights to rebellion, without fear of the scenario that Hobbes presents in his state of nature. But notice that nowhere in Locke's account is there an equivalent to Hobbes's reflections on glory. The desire for recognition and for eminence, indeed preeminence, doesn't appear anywhere in Locke's account. Perhaps that's because Locke's account is in many ways built on Protestant Christianity rather than on, as it were, 17th century science as Hobbes is. But it raises an important question for us, because if the problem of recognition, of love of self, as Rousseau will call it, if the desire for recognition and for eminence over others is a central feature of human beings, then Hobbes's argument may look more compelling, and Locke's argument may appear less attractive, less engaging than it otherwise does. Addressing that issue will be a central concern for another social contract theorist, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his second discourse on inequality. But for us, we're left with the question: does the desire for recognition represent a problem with which Locke does not fully deal? Goodbye.